been kind of following the drama in Washington on legislation and the government trying to decide what to do about a problem that it sees as a mammoth issue for the government, critical infrastructures around the United States, the security of those. And business similarly puts it at the top of their list as a security issue, a business issue for business. And what you find is that there's still a disconnect between what's happening in Washington from a legislative standpoint, which is slow as molasses, and business, which feels that this is all a one-way avenue. We'll get a call from government saying, you've been hacked, we need information from you about what's going on. But when business asks for help, or when business looks to the government to say, here are some new perpetrators out there, that information isn't as forthcoming. What's the status of this, and what's the fix?
Well, because of Snowden, legislation is dead for the foreseeable future, in my view. We got close last year. What I would offer from the standpoint of the government, having lived there for most of my life, we have rules, we have laws, policy, framework for classifying information. Served us well in World War II, served us well in the Cold War. It is not serving us well today, but the culture and the rules are still in existence. So it's an anathema to a government organization to have sensitive or classified information, to share it freely with the public sector. I would argue one of the lists that was included for what we need to do going forward is a public-private partnership, which means information must, I repeat, must be shared between businesses. It must be shared from businesses to government, and just as importantly, from government back to businesses. There's only one place in America where we have an organization that's chartered to break codes and read the other guy's mail. It's all foreign. We'll probably get into that later, but it's a foreign effort, and much of the threat to American business and others is nation-state derived. It's nation-state initiated. So if we're going to have an effective system for addressing this issue for corporate America and for our international partners, it's absolutely required that we have legislation that's passed by the Congress and signed by the President as a forcing function to require those in government with sensitive information to share it with the private sector, and to create an environment where not only the private sector is encouraged to share among yourselves, but that you are granted liability protection for sharing back with the government. What does that mean? If you adopt that NIST standard that was recommended, that will become mandatory. If not, even if it's voluntary, it'll become mandatory through the court process. If you meet that standard and you're sharing the information, in my view, you should be given liability protection against frivolous suits from a breach that will come, and breaches will come no matter what we do.
Customers who say that you shouldn't have lost my information,
or you compromised my information or some broad segment information, therefore I'm going to sue you, and it'll go to a court, and then they'll say, well, what was the standard? It will be the NIST standard, and then the question will be, did you meet that standard? If you didn't meet it, and you already know the answer, if you did meet it, what I would say that in legislation you should be given liability protection. So that's the mix, and some in the House get it, some in the Senate get it. We had 14 bills or drafts or amendments last year. They all failed. The President's, in sort of frustration, signed an executive order a year ago. It started the process for the NIST standard and so on. And it does some things, does not have the power of legislation, does not have a forcing function to require my old community, the intelligence community, to change their rules so we can defend the country and more specifically corporate America, particularly those engaged in the critical infrastructures.
Yeah. So what kind of information is the government sitting on that might benefit business that could be shared?
Well, for example, the most prolific, probably 80% of what goes on in the globe comes from China. One of your colleagues earlier said, I wouldn't say it in print. I don't know why not. I mean, many of us have. It's in print. The government said it. It's unclassified. The Chinese are breaking into every corporation in America. I've got a team, and we do this. We've never examined any major computer system that wasn't penetrated with malware. So the Chinese are very prolific. Their intent is to capture source code, research and development, intellectual property, business plans, innovation ideas, anything of that nature, and why. They want to use it for their own benefit. It's a policy of economic espionage, and just to contrast that, the United States, the UK, a few others, by policy, we do not engage in economic espionage. We engage in espionage for government secrets and military capabilities and war plans and the usual kind of things that you would expect the intel community to do, but we do not do economic espionage. The Chinese do, the Russians do, the French do, the Israelis do, others do, but the most prolific are the Chinese.
When you say that there's no major computer structure that the government's examined that hasn't been hacked.
Not the government. The government could examine it, they'd find the same result, but I'm in the private sector and I do it as a service to corporations.
So most companies have been hacked.
Right.
Let's go to our first audience question, if we could, so just on that topic. Has your company been hacked, resulting in some sort of damage? That is either theft of IPR or of IP or scrambling your information or releasing private data. And while we're waiting for the vote to come in, the recommendations from the cybersecurity group did include a better public-private partnership. Right. So the sensitivity to this is out there in the business community. They definitely want it. Give us your reaction to the other recommendations that the task force got.
Well, they were prioritized, I think, and the first was the NIST standard. The second was the public-private partnership. I would say that should be first. And I go back to my earlier comments. It has to be a forcing function. You have to require government to do it. You have to provide incentive and liability protection for the private sector to engage. The NIST standard, I would say, is, in my view, is the number two. Getting us to a common standard is very, very important. I think tougher penalties. Most of that reflects to me criminals, and that's a problem. Hackers, insider that would compromise your information and so on. It would serve a purpose. I'm not sure I'd put that on my top four.
Yeah.
International standard, I think, is something we're going to have to face up to sooner rather than later. Here's what I mean by that. Even for the Chinese and the Russians, who do this in a very dramatic way, long term, I think they will realize that it's in their self-interest to have a global information infrastructure that is reasonably secure and is protected from this kind of activity. So I would say that there's some early initiatives between the United States and Europe. It's very early, but eventually we're going to have to address this just like we did international arms control as an example. And let me use one other example just to make my point. There's an acronym, it's ICAO, and I can't even remember what it stands for, but it's basically the agreement for flying airplanes over nation states. And it was passed in the height of the Cold War, agreed to in the height of the Cold War. So we flew airplanes over Cuba, over Russia, over China, because it was in the self-interest of all those nation states to have those international airplanes flying passengers or whatever they were carrying over airspace to get them delivered. That was a hard fought, but nation states eventually figured out this is in our self-interest. Now you had to do some things. You had to have a flight plan, you have to have a safe airplane, you had to say what the cargo was, and you had to have a flight route. But we took a long time, but worked all that out. I would say a similar kind of effort will have to be established for an international agreement for an information structure, information technology structure, public switch network that's secure.
Yeah. So 55% of people say yes, 29% say no, 17% say they don't know. Your best guess would be that that number should be a little closer to 100%?
Yeah, 98%.
Yeah.
At some level.
Yeah. Let's go to our second question, because it again deals with this public partnership idea. In addressing the problem of cybersecurity for companies, the government should, one, play a bigger role, two, leave it to business. So if you're dealing with and while we're waiting for the vote, if you're dealing with an international agreement, how do you get the biggest perpetrators to sign on, the Chinas and the Russias and even the French? If, China over the last 30 years has ripped off enough IPR out of this room to generate, who knows how many points of GDP. They're looking at the need to stay competitive, and they're looking at what's made them competitive up until now. Why would they sign an agreement?
I think it'd be a long, difficult negotiation, and you'd start with something small and work through it over time, just like we did with arms control for nuclear weapons or that sort of thing. The Chinese, I've been there, I've sat down with their leadership, I talked to their members of the Politburo, I talked to a lot of the military counterparts and also their state security apparatus. Their view is they missed the Industrial Revolution. They were subjugated by the West. They are the creators of innovation and science for much of our history.
No shortage of innovation in their history.
If you look at if you measure it from GDP, out of the last 2,000 years, Chinese are at the top at least 1,600 years out of that 2,000 years. So they have a view of the world that says, we missed our time, it's now time for us to return. So you'd have to overcome that. You'd have to sit down and talk to them about why this would be in their self-interest in the long term. One of the speakers earlier mentioned pollution in China. I was amazed. The Yangtze River is, I think it's the third longest river in the world. The last 200 miles in it, nothing lives because they dump sewage and everything else into it. And the coal dust is so bad, it's poisoning them. They will have to deal with that. And I would argue that just like they'll have to deal with that because their citizens will force them to in time, they're going to have to be forced to deal with this other issue of
Let's see what the results were on this. Still a third of people feel that it should be left, or a little less than a third, feel that it should be left to business alone.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
I mean, when I say a role for government, it's not, the government they're not going to do everything, but the government has unique information that is not available to business. And the only thing I'm arguing is we need to create an infrastructure and a forcing function around that to require what the government has in the defense of the nation to share it with the business community. Just like we would conduct our mission in the Cold War to understand what the Soviets are doing, the Russians are doing, or where the missiles were, whatever we were doing was in the defense of the nation. The paradigm has shifted now where the more important thing is how are corporations being penetrated and the intellectual capital being extracted from them.
Yeah.
That is a service the government can provide that corporations can't do for themselves, because you're not going to break code. You're not going to go penetrate foreign systems and try to get ahead of the problem. One of the other speakers mentioned the shift from signature analysis, and he was absolutely right. I agree with that 100%. I'm amazed that the companies that do the signature-based protections are still as viable as they are. We have to shift to behavioral analysis, and getting ahead of that in a dynamic way I believe, would be a partnership between the government and the private sector. Let me add one other feature.
Behavioral meaning?
Seeing activity in the net that allows you to be predictive. Mm-hmm. And the point I would make with regard to the government doing this, the government's, it's legal, it's authorized, it's large, I mean, it's billions of dollars, it's world-class mathematicians, and it's focused. But a lot of the innovation about how it works and where it comes from the private sector. So in a sense, getting it from government is just replaying it back from the private sector. One of the strengths of the U.S. government is that it draws on the private sector for what it builds and what it does and what it uses. And matter of fact, it doesn't build anything. It just uses what the private sector produces.
Does the government know about all different types of malware that it hasn't communicated to the private sector?
Yeah, that's my point.
And that malware has subsequently found its way into corporate America and swiped stuff.
Right. The only place we've been able to deal with it somewhat was in the Department of Defense. The secretary, the deputy secretary got fed up with it, and they said, look, to all you major corporations, the big guys, the guys that make airplanes or tanks or ships or whatever, if you're going to do business
the Defense Department has an interest in keeping
absolutely.
Private.
Exactly, because what was happening is the Chinese were taking all the planes. Yeah. They said, if you're going to do business with us, you've got to raise your cybersecurity standard. Well, then it became a dialogue. Well, wait a minute, if you're going to require that of us, help us. So what the National Security Agency started to do is provide signature-based information on that malware, never used, so that as it transited to a corporation, it could be stripped out. Now, interesting, when that was proposed, the Defense Department proposed it took a year for the government to sort through that. The debate was, if you strip malware from an email destined for a corporation, is that monitoring? So we got wrapped around the axle of the government's role in monitoring. A lot of the debate that's going on right now with regard to what Snowden has claimed.
Yeah. Yeah. The notion of hacking back, you saw that in the Dennis Blair, John Huntsman Commission report, where they actually suggested that maybe laws should be modified to make it legal to at least pursue the hackers and identify where they have stored your stolen material, and at least make it inoperative, if not shut down their systems. Do you buy that, or is that feasible?
It's vigilantism. I believe in self-defense. I believe that corporations can be made more dynamic. I believe you can have predictive intelligence and do a lot of the things to be more dynamic in how you defend yourself. But now when you go back, more often than not, you're going to hack back into something that has nothing to do with your penetration. For example, if I'm a nation state and I want to go into Corporation X, I probably go to 8 different countries and 4 different universities before I would penetrate Corporation X. So now Corporation X is going to get angry. I want to poke back. Well, you might get the University of Texas or the University of Minnesota, not the perpetrator. So this is very, very complex. So what I would argue is if you are penetrated, do things dynamically to defend yourself, and then make some decisions very quickly, not 24 hours, like an hour. Should I contain? Should I mediate? Should I redirect? Whatever you need to do locally, and then let the law enforcement community deal with the idea of what do we do about it. And we have a national policy issue here about what do we do with the Chinese, about what they're doing to corporate America, when we want them to be our friend. We want them to be a market for us. We want to buy from them and sell back to them. So how do we manage through that space? So this is a very delicate policy and political issue for the nation.
We had a question this morning about Snowden, and I wonder if we could pop that back up. This is the one asking whether he should be prosecuted, granted clemency, or both. Maybe if you have that in the system, you could just show the results on the screen. But before that happens, you mentioned that Snowden is going to have a sort of a freezing effect on legislation. Why is that?
First of all, I was encouraged by the responses from the audience. It reflected to me a perception of what really happened that's closer to reality than what the public perception. So now, there's some in Congress. I mean, we all know the Congress is like a bell curve. You got the radicals on the one side and the radicals on the other side, and many of them have wanted to change the existing legislation since it was passed. Now, I spent 2 years of my life getting that legislation passed, and everything that the National Security Agency has been doing is foreign. You may disagree with the policy behind the legislation, but they were not breaking the law. Now, were there occasional technology screw-ups or a violation by an individual? Sure. Any corporation of 40,000 people, you're going to find a bad egg or two. But did they intentionally or willfully do something not authorized and captured in legislation? They didn't, and the President of the United States stood up the 17th of January at the Department of Justice and said, this is my finding. So it is not willful violation of law. It's all legal. We'll argue about is the policy behind the law correct? So 29% of people, of the CIOs, felt that Snowden did a public service. Right. Can we also see the results of the next of the next question, if you have that as well, which talks about prosecuting clemency or? I would say that the 29% probably focused on metadata collection. Most people don't understand what that is.
Let's come right around to that. So 67% said prosecuted. Only 4% granted clemency, but 30% said he should be prosecuted, presumably found guilty, carried through the justice system, but then granted clemency. Now, you don't buy that. You see the you say what really happened and what the public perception happened with Snowden. Tell us the difference between those two.
First of all, National Security Agency is a foreign intelligence organization. It only does foreign intelligence, and what people are reacting to, I think, is the metadata collection. Metadata is authorized in law. What does it mean? You take the who called whom, for what period of time, and it goes into a lockbox. When there is foreign intelligence that says a foreign perpetrator, a terrorist in Yemen as an example, called San Diego, it's a legitimate activity on the part of the National Security Agency to target that number in Yemen. But when it calls San Diego, there may be an interest in why is this terrorist in Yemen talking to someone in San Diego. So the question becomes, who is that? As monitoring that specific call, it is authorized in law because you're targeting the foreign end. Now, if they talked about fruitcakes and there's no intelligence interest, there's no report. If they talked about terrorism, you must issue a report. And from the intelligence perspective, you would say U.S. person A, U.S. person B. Now, it then goes to the Justice Department and the Attorney General to determine, is there a probable cause here to get a warrant? Now, the question that's asked is, if you talk to San Diego, who did San Diego talk to? Chicago, LA, Houston, whatever. Now FBI has a network of who the potential players are, and then they would get warranted access to go look at those players. That is, in effect, the way the system works. When the Director of the National Security Agency was confronted with that, he said, it's legitimate, it's authorized in law. And the staff in the White House says, well, we don't think you should be doing that. He said, we do what the law authorizes to do and what you make the priorities. So the President himself and the staff are going through the priorities now to say, is that something we want to do? The Director of the National Security Agency said, if you want to do it differently, if you want to have the carriers maintain that, or if you don't want to do it, it's okay with me, but remember, we're going to have a very short window to be able to listen to a foreign terrorist coordinating with someone in the United States and then be able to react that in sufficient time to prevent some act.
You once ran the agency, the NSA.
Yes.
You're convinced that that is not being misused, that Americans are not being spied on?
I'm absolutely convinced of it. Well, first of all, it's against the law. And the most effective force for enforcing the rules is the NSA workforce. If a colleague inside NSA does something inappropriate, the odds are at a very high percentage level that they would be turned in for inappropriate activity. Will you have an occasional foul up because of a technology issue? For example, there's a foreign telephone located in the Middle East, and the foreigner travels from the Middle East to the United States. It's roaming now. NSA may or may not know that the number they're following is now in the United States. What the audience probably doesn't appreciate is that foreigner from the Middle East who happens to be in the United States now gets the protection of a U.S. person. You can't monitor that unless you've got some specific interest, or there's evidence that that person is operating as an agent of foreign power. So it gets a little complex, but the bottom line is NSA is conducting its mission of foreign intelligence against legitimate targets and is not reading U.S. persons' email or accounts. The PRISM, everybody wants to know about PRISM. All PRISM was is an automated process whereby NSA would identify email from a foreigner to a foreigner. It just happens to reside in a U.S. ISP, Internet Service Provider. So PRISM was a way to get the foreign information only. No Americans. None.
So whistleblower should get 0 votes.
In my view. Others may disagree with that, but I think so. Here's why. Snowden has compromised more capability than any spy in U.S. history. And this will have impact on our ability to do our mission for the next 20, 30 years. We have a capability today that is global, it is extensive, and it is incredible in what it can do. And now, those who would be potential adversaries or terrorists or criminals or whatever set of bad actors you can imagine, they have a recipe for how to defeat our capability to penetrate their communication system. The one thing that was compromised is called the CBJB, the Congressional Justification Book for the Budget. And what that is, it describes to the Congress what capability do we need and how are we using it. So now if I'm Russia or China or whoever I am, and I've got the benefit of that, I know exactly where we had enjoyed success, what could be penetrated. I know exactly where we're not looking. So it now gives you a recipe for taking away our ability to look inside those countries and those foreign actors.
So Booz Allen Hamilton hired a contractor, Edward Snowden, who then perpetrated this theft of data from U.S. intelligence agencies. What went wrong? How did that happen? It was tremendously damaging to Booz Allen Hamilton's reputation. What happened here? What was the failing?
Well, let me start with damage to Booz Allen's reputation. Our stock value went up about 10%, so just sort of put that aside. A lot of people said, oh, it's tremendous damage. There's been no real damage. Here are the facts. He was a security guard for the National Security Agency. He got into the CIA's IT group, was sent overseas, discipline problems, so on. Eventually left, joined a company, went overseas to Japan. Decided he wanted to be back into the National Security Agency, into the key organization that is the top, the creme de la creme of what they do at the National Security Agency in terms of their mission. He broke into, administratively, he broke into their system and he took the test. He stole the test with the answers, and then he took the test and he aced it. And he walked in and said, you should hire me because I'm this good on the test. And they said, you are, we would like to hire you. And they offered him a position. He said, no, I don't want to be a GS-13, I want to be an SES, much higher rank. And they said, well, that wouldn't be fair to other members. If you're going to join us, you're going to have to join us at this level. That's when he turned. At this point, he said, he being narcissistic and having failed at most everything he did, he decides, I'm going to turn on him. And so he targeted my company because we enjoy more access than most other firms. We do core mission for a variety of players, Army, Navy, Air Force, NSA, CIA, others, because of the nature of the work that we do. If he joined us through the contracts we would have with the National Security Agency, he would get access to the National Security Agency. Now here are the other facts most people don't appreciate. He targeted us for that purpose. He was with us for 3 months. He never entered a Booz Allen facility. The government cleared him, not private contractors don't clear people, the government clears them. The government cleared him, the government vetted him, and the government invited him into their space for training. That's when he did his download. Once he got what he wanted, he put it on a thumb drive or a storage disk. He went back to Hawaii, and then he left for Hong Kong.
Shouldn't Booz Allen Hamilton have vetted him as well?
We do. We vet people. We verify their education. We look at their past employment. We do a lot of things. We looked at all those records, and they looked relatively benign. The government looked at all those records. In 20/20 hindsight, there were some things that he did along the way that weren't in the record, and they sort of caught up after the fact. The government will learn a lot from this process. They were not aggressive in dealing with the insider threat. First one was Bradley Manning. Thousands and thousands of documents, because the way that, if you think of the network, there's the unclassified network, there's what I call general service network, secret. That's where most of the information is. And then there's the top secret at the special level. Bradley Manning was in the secret level, but the issue was if you're in Guam, you're in Germany. If you're in the United States, you're in Iraq. And so sitting in Iraq, he could access all that information, put it on the devices he put it on, and turn over WikiLeaks. That was the first iteration. Second iteration was Snowden to do what he did. Like any organization, it costs money, and organizations have structure, and you have to have a forcing function. We now have one, so we'll get aggressive in the government now, or the government will become aggressive, about addressing the insider threat, two-man control, isolation of data, more encryption of data.
Also at your company?
Pardon me?
Are you changing your practices at your company?
Yeah. If you support the Department of Defense, you have no choice. We do. And so how we look today, security-wise, is very different from how we looked 2 years ago.
Let's go to questions. Folks in the audience? Questions? Yes, please.
First, thank you very much for the explanation. Thinking about the executive order, there was enhanced cybersecurity services as part of that. So companies like Booz Allen or Lockheed or others, maybe Dell SecureWorks, that are used to having a SCIF, would be provided with some of this intelligence that the government has. Do you see that moving forward? Because I haven't heard anything as of yet.
One of the instructions in the executive order was to direct the Department of Homeland Security to grant clearances more broadly, not just to those of us that support the Department of Defense, but more broadly. Moving pretty slow. Executive order is it's instruction from the president, but doesn't have the power of law. So it's moved a tiny bit. It's nowhere near what it has to be. And I would argue that it's not just those of us that do work at the classified level. It's probably the top 100 banks. It's the Fortune 500. It's anyone, in my view, that's dealing with information by dint of the fact that the nation now is digitally dependent. If you are dealing with information, if it's contaminated or destroyed or altered in some way, you could hurt literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Those are the organizations that need access to this information. And there needs to be this partnership for exchange that's dynamic. When I say dynamic, what I mean is network speed. If a bad actor overseas is going to do something to cause degradation, they could do that at network speed. So you have to see it coming and react to it almost in near real time. Let me use one example. The U.S. economy is, I haven't looked in the last few months, but last time I looked, it's $16 trillion a year. Big number, largest in the world, most productive economy in the history of the world. If I ask you how much money moves through the U.S. banking, our global banking system every day, you get a lot of different answers. Well, the answer is $13 trillion. So our economy is $16 trillion a year, but $13 trillion a day moves through the banking system. 2 banks in New York clear over half that money. What happens when someone gets inside that to contaminate or just cause uncertainty in the clearing system? I would argue that that would cause a probably more disruption and damage, economic damage, than 9/11. So that's the level of this problem that, you know, from the seats I've occupied, I'm arguing we have to be serious about addressing this and sharing information, government to industry, industry back to government.
Other questions? I'm sorry, right here, yes.
Thank you very much for the explanation. I'm Manish Kapoor with New Star Energy. We operate oil pipelines, so we kind of fall into the critical infrastructure, so as to say. And so I hear what you're saying, Miss. We like the fact that, you know, the part that the government has or what NSA has, and we would like to hear more from it. But one of the things that that's prescribed in the executive order is something like a SOX body that we see.
Say it again.
A Sarbanes-Oxley kind of a body. Yeah. Well, that's a term that I coined, but it's a body that will come and kind of audit your system. And so that's a fear that our or similar organizations have is, you know, do you want somebody, especially from the government, come and audit your systems every so often, and how big that is going to become if that happens?
When Lieberman Collins introduced their bill in the Senate last year, the debate was a standard or a voluntary standard, and where they kind of worked it around to was voluntary standard. The position that the Chamber of Commerce took was exactly yours. We don't want any standard, because even a voluntary standard will become mandatory. And the debate was, how do you incentivize industry to agree to this standard? And everybody was worried about what you just said, Sarbanes-Oxley. I mean, I've little experience out in the private sector in Sarbanes-Oxley. I was on the board of directors of a small company. We spent all our profit being compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley, so I know what you're describing. So how do you produce a situation where there's benefit to you? And I would argue that if we can incentivize it so you're not punished for sharing with your partners, your sector, antitrust, that sort of thing, it's forgiven, and you get liability protection for having met that standard, then maybe an audit would be worth the pain. And I would argue probably in the legislation the audit should be made reasonable. Have a private sector audit firm do the audit, or self-certify and have some confidence that your self-certification is valid. So the question then becomes, well, how do you know it's valid? So that's the part that's going to be a negotiation.
That's the liability protection side of it definitely is the carrot that state compensates.
Yeah.
Other questions? Please.
Appreciate the open and frank dialogue so far. I guess when I take a look at the Snowden situation, I have as a U.S. citizen, I don't like it at all. But I have an easier time getting my head around how he got access than how he got access to so much. When I think about kind of how, like, data gets tiered in terms of access this way and tiered in terms of access this way in our company, Can you say a word or two about
Sure.
how he did, and then what steps you think are being taken, and are there things that we should be considering in terms of how we put together our data?
Inside the National Security Agency, there are actually 4 levels of information access. One of them is administrative. And your authorities, you know, what the executive order says, what the law says, what the court says, that's basically at the basic administrative level. And NSA, like many businesses, puts that on a wiki so everybody has access. So the very first thing he pulled off that was the FISA court order authorizing the metadata collection program for another 6 months. So that had tremendous impact because the interpretation of that was, oh my God, NSA is monitoring U.S. persons. So that's one level. The next level is reporting. That's the results of collection, some activities going on, and the reports are written in a way to attempt to give you the information without revealing the source. The next level gets into how do we do what we do. Snowden had access to the first level and the second level. He had very limited access into the third tier. And he had almost no access into the fourth tier. The fourth tier is really when you get down the technical way you had a success in this enterprise or this particular activity. So when he had broad access, he took 1.7 to 1.8 million documents. About 0.7, 0.8 million of those are basically just reports, and it's tactical in nature. About 1 million of them talk to, no kidding, insights to understand the United States signals intelligence system. He also downloaded, because in that level of access was information from CIA and DIA, other intelligence organizations, that is more all-source reporting. So that would be very, very valuable to an adversary. And he's claiming, well, I'm not giving this to China, I'm not giving this to Russia. If the Russians don't have this, I'll be very disappointed in my counterparts about their level of capability.
But not through that way.
Anything else? Any other questions? Please.
Admiral, you and I went through the Walker stuff. And what I was wondering with your comment about things being dead for the year, what do you see in terms of the liability and other issues being the major blocks for Congress moving forward on this, and what can this group do to help?
When I make comments to a group like this, particularly informed citizens who are concerned, and you vote and you're engaged and you understand and so on, is you all have a representative and a senator, and they represent you, and so they should be informed on this issue with your point of view. We have to have this legislation. And as long as we don't have it, we're going to continue to sort of dribble along and suffer these kinds of major breaches. The Chinese are having us for lunch. Hackers and criminals, what happened to Target and others, is going to continue to happen. And so what I would encourage everyone in this room to do is to be focused on this issue, talk to your representatives, talk to your senators, talk to your CEOs. Congress will react on this when citizens demand that they react on it. We do things 2 ways in this country. Crisis. And from an intel guy's point of view, I'll tell you, never waste a crisis. Because when you're trying to get something done and the crisis happens, that's when you want to get A, B, and C done. So if you don't have the crisis where it's so dramatic, it forces activity, it has to be citizens demanding it of their representatives.
Is what the military has done a more secure web part of the answer, a .mil?
Well, the military can't go to war without the internet. They order the beans and the bullets and the orders and the aircraft and ships and so on. So they can't do it anymore without the internet. So they established something that they call .mil. Most people, you all understand this, but most people don't. The same glass pipe that carries your information or my email or a Department of State secret or the Department of Defense's top secret information is the same glass pipe. So what DOD did was they established .mil so that anything that moves from point A to point B is encrypted. And with encryption, you get the artifacts of cybersecurity, attribution and data integrity and non-repeat, all the basic facts. And so when we had an initiative in the Bush administration carried over the Obama administration, we wanted to create a .secure for government and the critical infrastructure and private sector. We got the government's going down that path, being managed by the Department of Homeland Security. It's called .gov, and that will be more secure. Along the way, although the president gave us $17 billion to do this, first president, second one gave us $18 billion over 5 years, the bureaucracy started to fight internally, and they forgot all about a .secure for the private sector. So the capability exists, it's there, it would just have to be initiated and completed, but there's no forcing function to make us do it.
Mike McConnell, thank you very much. Excellent briefing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.